Hello, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for attending. My name is Luke Mellor. I'm the marketing director for Pantonium, and today we have a very juicy topic. It is public transit privatization and on-demand transit. And today we are joined by, first of all, Jeremy Eves, who's the head of sales at Pantonium, and we are joined by three special guests who have given us their time today. Firstly, we have Michael Mousley, who's hailing from the city of Stratford. He's the manager of transit for the city of Stratford. Calling in from Alberta, Canada, we have Ettore Iannacito, who is the manager of transit services for the city of St. Albert. And then hailing in from all the way from Arkansas is Joel Gardner, who is the executive director of Ozark Regional Transit, which covers the cities of basically all of Northwest Arkansas, including the cities of Fayetteville, Springdale, Rogers, and Bentonville. Now, today's topic was chosen by Pantonium mainly because of a letter that really shook up the transit industry in Ontario. So maybe not everybody is familiar with this because we have an international audience today. But basically, in August of this year, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation wrote a letter to the transit agencies of Ontario. And in that letter, they included a line that requested all transit agencies, to review their low performing fixed routes and to see if they could economically replace them with a microtransit service. And this ignited a firestorm of debate all across Ontario. And it was largely about the implication of privatization, because even though Ontario did not, the Ontario Ministry of Transportation did not specifically say to privatize transit, most people in the industry assumed that microtransit meant privatization. Now, Pantonium doesn't have any, we're agnostic on privatization, but we were also not very sure what the transit industry themselves thought about these implications and what they thought about this actual ask by a government agency to consider replacing traditional fixed route services with microtransit. So we wanted to bring together some of Pantonium's partners and clients today to discuss this and to really learn from them what they think of privatization and where they see transit going in the future, especially with this ongoing pandemic impacting riderships and impacting the financial sustainability of transit. So today we're going to have a very open discussion on these topics and hopefully learn something and take away some new understanding of how the private sector and the public sector can work together to make a more sustainable and effective transit service. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Jeremy, who's going to kick off the main discussion.
Thanks a lot, Luke, and thanks to everyone for joining, as well as special panelists. The format's going to be fairly conversational, and I really just want to learn a little bit more about what people think, right? And so I think that a lot of people that are on, the audience today, they're curious about different opinions, and they want to see, how do people make decisions, and that's kind of where I want to head. So first off, I'm going to start with Ettore and just say, when someone says privatization and transit, what does that make you immediately think of when you say privatization?
You're asking me, Jeremy? Is that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right, well, it can mean a lot of different things. I've worked both in a public transit setting where the service was delivered by a municipal entity and it was completely owned and operated. So the operators were hired and trained by that municipality and the trade transit agency. I've also worked for a municipality like St. Albert, where we own all the assets, meaning the buses, we own the garage, we own the hoist, and so forth, but we outsource the drivers and the operators. So that means we have a private sector contract with PWT, for example, Pacific Western, that provides the operators that drive our buses. So we're not responsible for hiring the operators. We're not responsible for any disciplinary action. We're not responsible or any union agreements between the two. So there's that barrier. We hire a private sector to provide that service for us, and they in turn provide the infrastructure, meaning they provide us with an operations manager to oversee the operations. They have the route inspectors and so forth. So we provide them with the direction and the guidance as to what we're looking for. And there's a reporting system, and of course I manage the contract, etc. And that's how we deliver the service here. So it is a private, public, contractual service delivery model.
And for you, was that decision made before you joined St. Albert, or
Yes.
were you part of it? It was, yeah.
It's been a long time since they had that.
That they've had a third-party relationship, yeah. And I'll switch over to Joel down in Arkansas. Joel, describe how your operation is run. Do you have any private sector partners besides, software and those types of things? Are there any operations that are, provided by third parties?
Not in this particular location. Like Ettore, I've been on both sides of it, where we've had municipality run systems where everything from assets to the drivers are owned and operated by the municipality, and also where only the assets were owned by the municipality, and then everything else was done through a transit management contract. On my side, I was a First Transit Americas guy for a number of years. And so I've seen both sides of the benefits of, depending on the location I was at, the benefits of either having everything run by the municipality or through the transit management contract. But when you bring up privatization, that word right there, and as it relates to microtransit, the first thing that actually happens with me is I just start getting the heebie-jeebies over the fact that now we're talking about an unregulated asset that's sitting out there when it comes to the, and I'm not digging on the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, but when we look at those types of lack of regulations that are on those, whether it be drug testing, whether it be asset management, doing a microtransit in a public or municipality setting is a whole heck of a lot easier for me to wrap my brain cell around than for me to go ahead and say, oh, I want to privatize something like that. Because now I, as a consumer, I will personally lose all faith and or credence in whether or not A, that vehicle's been serviced, or B, that driver's been drug tested and it can get me safely from point A to point B, not under the influence of anything. And those are probably two of the biggest things that kind of screw with my brain cell when it comes to privatization of a microtransit.
And in your previous world, what benefits did you see of privatization?
Working with the transit management concept, where we got to be the controllers of the personnel, we got to handle the union contracts, we got to handle the hiring, the firing, everything to that aspect. It was good for us to go ahead and have that delineation between the municipality and the personnel themselves, as far as I was concerned. When we're working with municipality type personnel that are in a public transit setting, I have a tendency to feel that the majority of the people that are working directly for the municipality will get their job because they know somebody, because they've got a friend of a friend who's been in the municipality for an extended period of time. And there's a lot of influence that can come from those higher ups in the municipality, where when we're working with the transit management, it is the person with the best skills that comes through the door is the person that's brought in.
Understood. And closer to home, Michael, down in Stratford, what was your thought when you saw this message from the province about funding and that type of thing? What kind of went through your head when you saw these notices?
Well, privatization, I think that's always been kind of talked about in the background for a long time, and anything private, usually the bottom line is the bottom line. It's about, making a profit. Transit doesn't usually make a profit. It's always subsidized by, for us in Stratford, we own, it's all municipally run. We own all the assets, the employees. There's no outsourcing as far as how the operation is run or how the operation is serviced. And the privatization part seems to kind of come and go, and has for a very long time. And one has to wonder why it wasn't privatized beforehand. Joel made a lot of good points about using regulations and losing the rules. And for me, privatization, if it's going solely private, it's always about profitability. If it goes private, is it now affordable to customers? It's for me all about the bottom line. So I really sit on the fence about it. It's fairly vague as far as really what does privatization mean, and what happens to all the things that have been in place for decades and decades and decades. It's a matter of what does it look like, which I think is the bigger question.
Do you think that microtransit and privatization go hand in hand, or do you think that there's a way that you can have the same effect? Like you can have benefits of having a private operator running microtransit, and the city can see and does not lose the relationship with the customer. You still get the efficiency benefits that you're looking for. Is there a balance point there? Like Ettore in St. Albert, he's using PWT, who is an operator, but he hasn't lost track of his transit. Like he still knows what his transit system is doing, right? Is microtransit, is it have that capability, do you think?
Without seeing it firsthand, I think it could strike a half decent balance. It apparently works well in St. Albert. It's for me personally, it's that vision and what does this look like? That would be, but is it a good balance? Sure, I'm sure it could be a good balance. It's for me, it'd be a matter of what does it look like.
Ettore, do you have a comment? I mean, I'm not saying that you're running all microtransit, right? Because PWT runs your fixed routes and things like that too, right? So you're relying on that third party to kind of handle a lot of the administrative and operation components, but you don't feel like you've lost touch with your customer base at the same time, right?
No, not at all, because we design the service levels. We respond to customer inquiries. So we have a customer service portion there that deals with customer comments, feedback. They don't call PWT, they call us. So from a customer perspective, they really don't notice anything different. The service is delivered, the service design, we do it, and we schedule it. They just provide the drivers and manage that portion of our operations. We have our own mechanics, the buses are ours. From a customer perspective, they don't notice any different. And at least from my perspective, having worked in both types of models, I don't notice, any difference in our service delivery model from a customer perspective. And that I didn't mention that we do have the microtransit operating here, so we are partnered with Pantonium. We just started our on-demand service late July of this year. So that's another aspect that we bring to the table as well. And it's a different contract that we would have with Pantonium versus, our service delivery to put our conventional services with PWT. It's different, and the microtransit does take a little bit of getting used to, especially if our customers are used to a scheduled service. But we found that once we were over that hump, it works very well. So I can't say from a customer perspective that there's really that much difference.
So from your perspective, this is not a privatization of transit. It's using new technology, using a good third party, operator that you trust, and you're seeing the benefits all around, right? So
right. So what comes to my mind when you talk about privatization is someone doing my job, or someone taking over the whole business, and they do everything from planning, service planning, scheduling, managing the operations, And I did work for the Calgary Regional Partnership in the Calgary area. It was a nonprofit organization where we did go to a different model. We didn't own any assets, and basically we put out a contract to run a pilot for us with the private sector to provide the vehicles, basically a turnkey operation where I just would manage that operation from the partnership perspective. And it worked extremely well as well. So you can go to complete privatization to deliver the service, or a model where it's a combination or a complete municipal. I mean, you know, a lot of agencies want to retain control over it, and the model we have here in St. Albert, we're in full control. It's just, you know, we have that private contract to deliver the drivers, whether it's, you know, for Pantonium, we use the drive DTL or Pacific Western drivers, so it's not like we have a different set of drivers for those. We use the same contract, and it works extremely well.
Joel, if you got a letter saying you need to look for efficiencies in underperforming routes, I mean, you and I have talked about this in full disclosure. You know, Ozark is a customer of Pantonium, but you were already looking for efficiencies before, right? So tell me a little bit about, like, what are you looking for if someone says we have to find efficiencies? What do you think when you get that kind of request?
Well, I hope I'm doing my job well enough that I'm already doing that before somebody gives me a letter that says that I got to start looking for efficiencies. Because if somebody from the outside actually has to go ahead and tell me that I got to start looking for efficiencies, then they should also finish that letter out with, you better start looking for another job, because I'm not doing my damn job correctly. So when we're actually looking for efficiencies, we're actually looking to compare one route, of course, to the other as far as boarding, speed boarding, boardings and lightings. We're looking for, how many miles are we running where we're actually not transporting any passengers during those miles. How many segments of miles, I'll say, where we're not transporting passengers. And we were looking into this for years. I've only been here 6 years now, and we've been looking at it since I've been here, and finally we're getting to the point to where we can start making effective changes through it. Watching the growth and development of our community, how it's sprawling as opposed to urban rise. And then we started taking a look at types of programs that we could implement. And that's when we came across Pantonium, I'm going to say 2 years ago, and we started talking with you guys about what we can and cannot be doing and what we should and should not be doing. And I can tell you this right now, just, to be a Pantonium Kool-Aid drinker or cheerleader, the ability to switch some of our underperforming fixed routes into on-demand transit has made, number one, the optics to the general public a whole heck of a lot better. Number two, the reliability of the trips a whole heck of a lot better. I can say that our on-time performance, because we're now measuring on-time performance in trip pickup versus trip drop-off, is amazingly better, and the customer experience is much better also, because we're able to use the freedom of the on-demand transit to avoid the school gridlock zones, to avoid the heavy intersection freeway areas, so that we can deliver our our passengers to where they need to go. Hopefully I'm answering that question without sounding like I said too much of a Kool-Aid drinker or cheerleader for Pantonium. But
I can't slip you any bills over video, but we do appreciate the support there, and I want to make sure that, like, what does efficiency mean is really the question, right? Is it all about the numbers? Like, what is efficiency measured in? Maybe I'll move to Mike just to kind of reinforce that.
And I can brief that. Efficiency has two sides to it. It's got the statistical side, and then it's got the emotional side that the customer looks at on as far as efficiency, getting to where they want to go on time safely. And those customer complaints.
Yeah, it's not always about the cost per trip, right? Like you still need to be able to cover all your ridership, right? The people in your area that rely on transit, if you start having to cut fixed routes, you need to have something in place to backstop that so they don't get left behind. And so, you know, I think that you and I have had several conversations about the importance of that, even to the effect of maybe even expanding your service areas, right?
Yes.
So Mike, is what you're doing right now with on-demand, do you consider that to be microtransit?
Yes, I do. And we were in the same situation. You talk about efficiencies, and one of the excuse me, the complaints transit agencies get from the public or from is like, why are your buses running around empty at certain times of the day? And one of the low-hanging fruit for myself, and this is a process I started a couple years ago, was Sunday ridership. I would say it wasn't efficient. We used 3 buses on 6 routes for an hour service. So it could take you, depending what you wanted to do on a Sunday, it could take you an hour and a half to get from point A to point B. Now I consider Sundays efficient on both sides, from a costing operationally and from a service side of it, where I'm one less bus. I don't run a fixed route. The buses only go when they're dispatched to go to where they need to go. And the customers now are getting from point A to point B in 16 minutes instead of potentially an hour and a half if they had to wait for a transfer at the terminal to wait for the other hour for the other bus. To me, that's there's a balance there for on both sides as far as what efficiency means. And now the customers is totally in control of their schedule and transit schedule. So instead of waiting for a bus to come by based on a fixed schedule, they now have control. They are now dispatched. They are now fitting in their rides on transit when they want to go, not when transit says you want to go.
And so here's a question. What do you think? I mean, not every municipality is running on demand or micromobility or microtransit. What do you think is the concern, like from a transit manager's perspective?
Well, absolutely. For this type of platform, one size doesn't fit all. You could have a system that has a mix of an on-demand platform that ties into a fixed route. For agencies that are the size of Stratford, we only run half-hour service from Monday to Saturday with 7 routes from Monday to Friday. So we're not a large service. We don't interline bus. It's 1 bus on 1 route for the whole 16-hour service day. It's not necessarily, like I said, one size fits all. It could be combinations of, a fixed compared to an on-demand that tie in and interline together. For Stratford, it was a matter of Sunday was a typical day where ridership was low because it wasn't necessarily efficient, and it took you forever to get where you wanted to go. So that size fits Stratford on for Sunday. Are there other possibilities and potentials for to expand it in other low volume parts of the day, whether it's in the morning or later at night, or even expanding a service later in the evenings? We go to 10 o'clock during the week and 8 o'clock on a Saturday. Is there a possibility that type of platform could be introduced to expand service at a very reasonable or cheaper cost than what we would do on a fixed route? So it's hard to take a cookie cutter approach to this type of platform because everyone's different. Everyone runs their service different. There's certain points of the day that are different for everyone as far as volumes and ridership. But we found for the municipality here that the first kick at the can would be looking at Sunday because it wasn't very efficient for everybody.
Ettore, what do you think the landscape looks like for transit for the next 3 to 5 years, given the impact of COVID? Are you seeing maybe some of the requirements and regulations that have been in place for the last decade or more? Do you see those loosening up and shaking up a little bit, or do you still think it's going to be status quo going forward?
That's a good question. I think with the COVID situation, I think it's going to take transit agencies to think a little bit outside the box to get some of those customers back. And I just want to kind of relate that back to the Microtransit, the on-demand service. When I want to say a comment about the efficiencies. Where I see the efficiencies in our system is we were running a dial-a-bus service in 2 parts. So we split the city in 2, and one bus would service one part, and the other bus would serve the other part, and they never kind of crisscross. So you would literally have to make still a connection if you're wanting to go from one end of the city to the other. The on-demand service has really reduced that problem, because the entire city now has become our, landscape in terms of where you could go. So it's much more efficient in the fact that you get better area coverage, that if you were to provide that same area coverage with conventional service, it would cost you a lot more. So in terms of actually saving or comparing the on-demand service cost with the dial-a-bus service cost, I think it's probably about the same, but you're providing a better service by having better area coverage. You don't have customers waiting a long time, to get a ride. So there's efficiencies that you gain just by the fact that it's an on-demand service, and it gives you better coverage. In terms of COVID, well, our service is suffering. We're probably at about 30% ridership of what we normally would be if we compare the same time with 2019. We're trying to think of how we could, possibly increase our service levels. And anytime you want to look at increasing your frequencies on our commuter routes, for example, that go into downtown Edmonton, the ridership is not there. So you would be going against your own service standards to try and say, well, if I increase frequencies, maybe we'll get more riders. So you have to think about different types of ways to get that increase. And some of the things that we've been doing is we've been getting a lot of requests from companies that employ a certain number of people, and they have their own COVID protocols in place. So instead of starting work at maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, they have their employees coming in at 10 o'clock in the morning, and you can't come in early and you can't come in late because of the COVID restrictions within their own protocols. So they've been asking, us to kind of see what we can do. So we find that during this period in our transit life cycle, we're doing a lot more customized types of things that we normally may not do under normal circumstances to try and cope with ridership and perhaps get more people on our buses. So in the future, I think, and this is, I'm just talking with my own experience and opinion, I think it has to be a whole gamut of services that a transit agency will provide. You're going to have a need for conventional services, which we do. We fill buses going into Edmonton under normal circumstances. We've got our local services, and I believe it was Michael that was suggesting that people complain about seeing empty buses. Well, there's different ways to tackle that. You could do on-demand service maybe with a smaller vehicle. I did some work when I was with Edmonton Transit Service, and we modeled a 15-passenger on-demand van, which has definitely lower costs than running a conventional bus to do your on-demand service. So I think if you start thinking outside the box and thinking about how you can have a whole different, pot of different types of services to meet your transit needs, you might start to bring some of those riders back. And, I think on-demand does play a big part of it, and vehicle type plays a big part of it. So we would be looking at perhaps smaller vehicles, for our on-demand service in the future, right sizing the buses, 30 foot, 40 foot, 60 foot, to deliver a service where it's needed. So it seems to be a combination of a whole lot of factors that we're trying to prepare ourselves, to to deal with the future.
Joel, how do you think, do you see a speed up in terms of your ability to make decisions and changes, you know, given that that municipalities have to respond now to these ridership declines? Are people being, you know, like municipalities in transit changes are typically, from what, you know, our Pantonium is fairly new to the transit industry, and we notice that it does take quite a bit of time to get changes made to service or technology and that type of thing. And I understand the reasons for that, but do you see a change in the behavior of decision makers and budget approvers to help you maybe adapt more quickly?
Right now, I'm seeing, I will say, an escalated rate of approval on whether it be new technologies, whether it be new concepts, that type of thing, because we serve 4 different cities, 2 different counties at this point in time. So I have a oversight board that wants to see things happen quickly so that they don't think that their money is going to waste. And the ability to go ahead and implement, whether it be a new service, a new technology, regardless of what it is, that everybody locally is putting things on the fast track to go ahead and get things approved, because they want to see results right away, so that we don't, as we started to spiral into the lack of transit ridership in February, March, April, May, June, we were on the backside holding meetings to determine what we could do to put that ridership back on at least a leveling amount, as opposed to a dropping amount. And the ability to go ahead and get approvals has been very, very quickly. And even changing one of our cities, we had 3 fixed routes in that city. We changed it to two buses that are running the Pantonium software, and they are more efficient. They are doing as much. They stabilize the ridership, and the ridership is actually starting to increase now, based off of the fact that we were able to make that change so quickly with the support of the city, and the city saying, yes, let's get it done now. Let's plug the holes.
In the planning process, right now, you're using how many zones for on demand?
One zone right now.
Do you think what we're doing in your area is microtransit?
Oh yeah, I would easily consider it microtransit. And I've got it to the point where now that, like I said, I've got 4 major cities that I serve, and the one city has gone all microtransit through Pantonium. The city right next to it is considering it now. Right, they want to get it in for the 2021 budget, which starts in a couple of months. I've got a city to the south that has already said, yeah, we want to start looking at which areas we can go ahead and get this microtransit put in, because they see what it's been able to do to, like I say, plug the holes of ridership loss.
So transit is changing, is what you're saying?
Oh, all across the board, all across the board. And to go back a little bit to the privatization conversation, I hate to take us back in time, but I would want people to consider, when you're having the conversation of privatization, if you've had the concept that your public transit is part of the infrastructure of your community, which is what I've driven into this area right here. Why would you take Parks and Rec and privatize it? Why would you take your fire department and privatize it? Why would you take your police department and privatize it? I mean, Michael's right. The privatization is all about the bottom line, and the bottom line is the bottom line. So when we're talking about privatizing transit, that again gives me the heebie-jeebies of unregulated dollars, the only thing that we're looking at, and heck with customer service. Of course, goes to the extremes on that mentality. But if we're going to make changes, we need to make changes that we can control, and make sure that we're still putting out a quality product on time with quality results.
Absolutely. Michael, a lot of people don't know this, but Stratford's actually a fairly progressive city from a technology perspective. You host the autonomous vehicle testing track for AVIN, right? For Ontario. What other things are you looking at, to help improve the efficiency of the transit system there?
Well, I mean, in my mind, it's about offering the service as it is and trying to save some costs in the meantime. Now, pandemic aside, this was the Sunday on demand service. I'd actually started planning about a year and a half ago. It just, the timing was interesting when things started to roll out pandemic wise, and it was still focused on for many reasons, not just COVID, but for many reasons, to get that launched on a Sunday. It's all about, especially with you know, the technology, and it's not like dial a bus. I mean, it's been talked about and done for decades. It had, you know, lots of moving parts back in the day. Now we have the technology to make this on demand or dial a bus. It's all from here. You can do anything you want. You're your own dispatcher. You can set your own time and place. And I think it's the technology, because we're in that world now where everything's about technology. Not too many people pick up a phone anymore and call. It's all something done by a PC or on a tablet or a laptop or on your phone. It's all about making it seamless and easy to use without suffering of service. It's all about making it easy. And when we launched on July 5th on Sundays, people were ecstatic. It's like, I can do this all on my phone. I can get a bus. I mean, you can do anything on your phone nowadays. There's an app for everything. Why shouldn't transit be any different? And yeah, and bottom line is there, you know, besides the benefit for the customer, there's a benefit for the department. There's a benefit for the municipality, especially now. We're all starting budgets for next year, and we're all looking for some cost savings without having to suffer with less service than what we did before. So there's the big question is how do we maintain what we're doing and keep it sustainable, doing the same with less, let alone doing more with less. But I think these type of platforms are the more than with less in my mind.
So I just want to check in with Luke and see how we're doing for time and Q&A to make sure that we do have enough time to kind of get to some questions.
Yeah, I think we're doing okay on time. We have about 20 minutes left. I do have a question that it came in from somebody. Just somebody emailed me this question. I thought this would be a good one for all the panelists, or maybe one of you guys can take this one. But it comes from Sally Gale, and she's a manager for a nonprofit that does kind of a demand response service, I believe. And she asks, how do organizations like public transit agencies that have very long budgeting and funding, very long and complex budgeting and funding structures like a public transit agency, how do those organizations convert a fixed route service, which is she thinks that a fixed route service is a very predictable cost, and I think that's true. You know, this bus is going to run this route for this year, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars. How do you? And that's fairly predictable. But when you're providing an on-demand service that has a variable, it's an agile type of service that you can kind of add and remove vehicles day to day. And you could have spikes in riderships that you don't really have control over, and we've seen that happen. How do you manage a budgeting process for these types of on-demand services? Is there a different approach, or how do you look at it like that? And I don't know if any of you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, why don't we start with Ettore in St. Albert?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and you must have. Yeah. You have some experience with that already.
Okay, so that's a great question. When I was working with Edmonton Transit Services, they're in the middle of a complete network redesign. So some communities, based on their new standards, were left isolated without some transit services, and there were transit rides. So we knew there maybe were about 200 to 300 riders within those communities that now had very little access to transit and we wanted to offer a different alternative to them. And one of the alternatives was on demand. So without having any dynamic scheduling software like Pantonium or some of the other companies out there, I managed to model it manually because I have a scheduling background as well. I looked at the number of passengers that I needed to carry over the busiest hour. And if I'm using I modeled a 15-passenger van, I modeled the Uber, Lyft, and a 30-foot bus. And, you know, I just looked at the time I would need for possibly for each one of those different types of vehicles. And it was slightly different, of course, if you have lower capacity. And then I managed to figure out how I would possibly pick up all these people that I needed to pick up, and calculated the number of hours, and then, you know, just made some assumptions and costed out each type of vehicle that was needed to deliver this service. And of course, I was able to get some kind of a fairly valid estimate on the number of hours and what the cost would be per hour to deliver that service. And I came up with a number, and we asked the private sector for some information and said, you know, take a look at this and see if these numbers are fairly decent or not. And apparently the numbers were pretty good. So there's ways of doing it without going crazy. And, you know, if you don't have the ability to do that, for example, or you don't have staff or the time to do that, you might even put it out there to the private sector to come up with an estimate for you, which is also a great way to do it. That's the way we did it there. And then in St. Albert, it was fairly simple because we just replaced the dial-a-bus one for one. We had 2 dial-a-buses out there, so we have 2 buses out there for our on-demand service. It was a little bit easier because we knew how many hours we were using with the dial-a-bus, and we just basically kept everything more or less the same, and just went with Pantonium's recommendation, which is, you know, you can expand your service coverage. And that's the biggest benefit that I see right now, is that we can provide better service coverage in comparison to what we would need in resources from a conventional side. I hope that answers.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. And I do have a question of my own, and sorry, Jeremy, if I'm delaying things, because we do have quite a few open questions for the audience, but this is just for me. And just in the age of COVID, you know, what is a low performing route? Because let's, you know, we all have kind of an idea of what a good route is in fixed route transit lands, which is, I think it's usually around 10 to 15 riders per service hour, I think is the industry standard. But now across the board, you can't even, in some areas, you can't even put that many people in a bus at the same time anymore. So really assuming that this pandemic is going to continue for the next, you know, year or so, where we'll have to do some social distancing, and the ridership increases will probably be tepid as people slowly gain confidence to get back into transit. What is a low performing route in the day and age? So maybe I'll start with Joel. I saw you nodding, so I'm going to pick you out.
because they're all low performing routes. I mean, they really are. Yeah. I mean, how can I actually delineate between one and the other right now? But what I'm actually doing is I'm taking a look at the entire system as a whole and saying, okay, where can I put different programs in to, like I say, plug the holes of loss, and what can I do from my end to be as effective as possible in my community to provide the best quality transit that I can. And if it means leaving a fixed route on that's low performing and picking another area where I can put on-demand transit, that's what I'm going to be doing. If it means that I have to add another bus on so that I can maintain those social distances, that's what I'm going to be doing. Because right now, today, they are all low performing routes. And I personally can't set that standard anymore. Pre-COVID, yeah, we had a standard. Now, in today's day and age, that standard, you might as well wad it up, throw it out the window, and never look at it again.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's what I see across the board on the industry is the numbers that we used to hold sacrosanct are now irrelevant. And Jeremy, I think, did you have any other questions or comments, or can we go to the audience Q&A?
Well, I'm looking at the Q&A now, and I'm just going to I'm going to start with the most upvoted question from Willem Klippenhauer. And I think it's actually a really good question. And it's on-demand projects look very different depending on the types of vehicles and the service standards, service areas, service type. You know, is it door-to-door, stop-to-stop, stop-to-door, you know, paratransit, specialized transit, all sorts of different things, right? Is it one zone? Is it multi-zoned? Do you use, you know, sedans versus 30 or 40 foot buses? So do you find that there is confusion among the public, you know, politicians, transit managers, riders, about the differences between these configurations? And do you think that contributes to the reaction of the idea of privatization because there's a lack of clarity on what this actually means? And I'll go with Michael.
I mean, Stratford's a municipality of 33,000, so it's not a large municipality. When we started the Sunday on demand, it was stop to stop, so we have 279 bus stops. We've kind of left the door-to-door aspect of it to the parallel transit mobility bus, which I also look after as well. For those that needed a little bit more assistance, but it was very seamless as far as switching to that kind of platform. We just use the existing bus stops that all transit riders already know where the bus stops are, and they know where they need to go to and where the bus stops are at that. So it was simple to do that way, and the transition, like I said, was very simple. It was very quick. I mean, we did focus heavily on the marketing aspect a few weeks out just to make sure everyone got as much information as they could, and we would talk. It was easy to do, and wasn't complicated.
But in general, do you think that folks that are not as involved in transit day to day, do you think they understand what on demand or microtransit really is? Like, do they understand there's so many nuances, and how do we clarify that message? Is kind of like, I think that's Willem's question. So.
Do people know of it? Do they kind of compare it if they know about Uber, maybe, or Lyft, or those types of services? I think they kind of relate it to just kind of Uberish on a 30 or 35 footer or 40-foot bus. I think, at least from the comments that I received, even from people that don't use transit, is one of great acceptance as far as what we're trying to do, whether it was, you know, trying to cut down on emissions, or just cost, right, to the municipality as far as how we operate, because it is a lower cost. So I got comments from transit ridership that were very happy with it as far as the efficiency, and I even have a lot of comments from ones that aren't transit users that understand what we're trying to do, because they can kind of relate it to things on a smaller scale, like an Uber or a Lyft. We're just doing it more in mass and those other platforms.
So it sounds like, you know, Uber had a fairly strong media recognition, but maybe as more of these projects roll out and get more airtime, people will start to understand what on-demand transit actually means, you know, from a transit perspective.
Correct.
Yeah. Ettore, we have another upvote. We have an upvote that's actually directly sent to you, and it's what has the adjustment with customers been like to the Pantonium on-demand model, and what has been the most challenging aspect, either for the riders or the agency? And then a third question: what do you anticipate it will save you in public funds by implementing on demand?
That's a great question. So our biggest concern was how are we going to communicate with the public on how to book a ride, or, you know, what the on-demand service is all about. So what we did all of our communications, and it was difficult in the time of COVID because we would probably have gone out and done some public engagement and showed people the various locations throughout the city. This is what we're proposing. This is how you would use this system. Give us some feedback. But we couldn't do that because of COVID. So we relied heavily on our website and just taking phone calls. The biggest adjustment has been with people booking the trip, not knowing how to book a trip, and literally our customer service staff having to take them through that process. Many customers would just call our staff and have our staff book the trips for them, but our staff is excellent, and they would show them, literally take all the time that was needed to help them out and teach them how to book a trip. Some confusion over where you're going to be picked up, making connections from if you're coming off a conventional route at one of our transit centers, a commuter route, will that on-demand bus be there waiting? When we would say, no, you have to still book your trip. So it's basically the communication piece on how this works with all the varying different possibilities that you can't possibly plan for. But once you get those issues or concerns being raised, it's how you deal with those that make the customer experience a lot better for them. So in our first couple of months, we got a ton of phone calls. We have people that don't have a phone. We have people that don't have a computer at home. And, you know, we're not here at 9 o'clock at night to take a phone call and say, can you book a trip for me? So it was a bit challenging in that respect on how do we deal with these people. Honestly, once a couple of months went by, our calls to our customer call center here and customer service reps have gone down tremendously. I'd say we're probably taking more than 50% less calls on the on-demand service, or very few calls now. It's usually, can you help me book a trip because I don't have a computer or a cell phone at this point. So the biggest, I think, issue for us was because of COVID and we couldn't go out there, is how to train the customer to use the app to book a trip, or their computer and on our website to book a trip. I think that was the biggest obstacle. We haven't had too many complaints as to, well, you know, your dollar bus service was a lot better in comparison. Mostly it was related on how to use the on-demand service. In terms of cost, we don't have a whole lot of information because we've only been operating this since the end of July. So we're not in a position to really evaluate the effects on our cost, because I don't believe we have our entire customer base because of COVID. So we're still running around the same percentage in terms of ridership as we are with our conventional routes. We're still running at about 30%, you know, with our on-demand services, what we normally got in terms of ridership with our dial bus, which is in line with everything else that we offer in terms of service. So at around the 6-month mark, we're going to do a complete evaluation if we're, you know, COVID would allow for that, and look at the cost and compare the costs and so forth. But it's not that easy to do right now because I don't believe we have our full ridership capabilities and what we anticipated in terms of rides.
And I think, to be fair, I think I would like to get an answer from Joel and Mike also on what has been the most challenging aspect for you or for the ridership when deploying an on-demand transit model. Joel, start with you.
I'm going to say the education of the workforce. Right now we've got, let's see, we've got Pantonium, Passio, and Paraplan. We've got 3 programs that we're using here. We've got Paraplan for our ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act related complementary paratransit. We've got Passio, which is our fixed route software. Now we're throwing another bit of software at the employees and getting the employees to understand the software on the bus as they are doing their pickups and their deliveries. Then also on the backside, on the non-customer facing side, was the, like Ettore was saying, being able to educate a rider on how to book a trip. Our first few months, we had to make sure that every dispatcher, anybody who picked up a phone, knew how to teach somebody to book a trip. I mean, it comes down to that, give a fish, teach to fish type of mentality. And we found out that the more we could spend on that first phone call with an individual on how to walk them through booking their own trip, we would almost never hear from them a second time because we had to make sure it was done thoroughly. And that was the biggest challenge, is making sure that our guys and gals here knew exactly what to say, how to say it, so that it could be understood by anybody from flip phone technology to no computer technology to the latest and greatest in smartphones. And now that those conversations have occurred almost a year later, our only phone calls when it comes to ODT are people that just don't have computer technology. And yeah, there's still a few of them out there, but that was probably the biggest challenge that we had, is getting drivers, operators on one side to switch between the 3 Ps, Pantonium, Paraplan, and Passio, in their mindset of what they were doing for the day. And then also getting the staff on the backside to be able to educate the people on the other end of the phone on how to walk through that programming.
That's great notes. Mike, I'm actually going to give you a different question. We have an upvoted question. It relates to the US, but I think actually North America as a whole, transit agencies receive hundreds of billions of dollars in federal aid. And also there's now some new funding to mitigate the impacts of COVID. How can transit agencies be incentivized or nudged, pushed to explore these types of efficiencies that you're seeing with on-demand? So if they're not already doing it and they're maybe reluctant to do it, what are other ways that you can nudge, your colleagues or maybe the government should be nudging folks to pursue these instead of with, a stick? Are there other ways to do this? So.
Well, as with anything, money speaks, money talks, right? So, and one thing, it's a lot of lobbying that needs to be done in the background or in the forefront, as far as getting everybody on the same page as far as what our wants are, what our needs are, and not just the agencies, but I mean, we also speak for the public that is the ridership. It's very important that to be innovative, such as Stratford, we have a lot of innovative things that happen here. Transit with on-demand and other technology type things. It is not new to the residents here, and it wasn't that hard for people to get on board as far as how to learn how to use this type of platform. But I think as far as funding, it's now, of course, I can't speak for what's going on in the U.S., but it's always about funding, and the governments here, provincially and federally, have through the ISIP program they have put a lot of funding out there for capital, not for operating, of course, but they have in the past put out quite a few dollars to get like a Stratford a little bit more updated compared to the bigger centers, which is real important. I mean, transit, you like to have transit when you go from city to city to offer the same service, whether it's 7 routes or whether it's 85 routes or 220 routes. You want to make sure it's sustainable, it's the same, but all looks the same for the most part, and offers the same type of service. Smaller municipalities don't necessarily always have the capital to do these upgrades, whether it's new buses, whether it's technology or whatever it might be, the infrastructure behind it, that sometimes there just isn't a lot there. So it's a matter of nudging political parties to, you have to put your hand up sometimes to say, hey, you know what, we need this, our neighbors have this, we could really use this. It's important, the lobbying aspect, as far as you got to keep transit in the forefront, and whether that's for an on-demand platform or expanding routes or putting in new service or whatever the case may be, or new buses. I think it's important that transit for whatever its wants and needs. We're at the front of the line because it's all about being funded, especially for like myself in a small municipality that doesn't have access to that type of financial means.
Very good.
Okay, so thank you. I know we're coming over our time limit just by a couple of minutes, but we do, as everybody in the public transit industry is, it's all about getting there on time. So I think we're gonna end it there.
Really appreciate everybody's time, and we look forward to our next sessions coming up. Hope everybody has a great rest of the week, and we'll take it from there.